Willem Engel. If you were in the Netherlands during the pandemic, you definitely know his name. He became one of the most visible and, controversial critics of the government's COVID policies. But his story as an activist didn't just pop up out of nowhere. To really understand his battle with the state, we have to look at the experiences that he says shaped his entire worldview. From the second he stepped into the public eye, Willem Engel's identity was basically split down the middle. On one hand, you have the media's favorite label for him, the dance teacher. And on the other, you have the reality of his background, an academic with a degree in biopharmaceutical sciences. Now, according to Engel, this was no accident. He's convinced it was a deliberate strategy to discredit him from the very beginning.
Okay, so to really get a handle on his point of view, we're going to break his story down into 5 key parts. First, we'll look at how a scientist ended up becoming a dance teacher. Then, we'll cover a major battle his family fought with the state years before COVID. After that, we'll dive into his first scientific doubts about the pandemic response, then the really dramatic stuff, the court cases and media showdowns. And finally, we'll get to the pretty shocking conclusion he ultimately came to.
All right, so before we can really dig into the activist, we've got to go back and meet the academic. Because before all the protests and court battles, Willem Engel's story actually starts in a lab. And he was on a pretty clear track to becoming a professor.
I mean, he was on this clear path, right? He graduates from Leiden University with a degree in biopharmaceutical sciences. And then he spends 6 years doing his PhD research. Everything is pointing towards a life in academia. But then, in 2008, he takes a trip around the world that completely changes his life. He says he had this major epiphany in a park in Auckland, and just like that, he walked away from it all. For the next 12 years, dance became his entire world.
And you have to understand, for Engel, this dance teacher label wasn't just a description of his job. He saw it as a weapon, used by what he calls the shadow power. In his mind, it was their way of looking down on physical work, but more importantly, it was a way to paint him as totally unqualified to have an opinion on anything scientific.
Okay, now let's jump back in time to a really crucial event that happened almost a decade before the pandemic. For Engel, his family's fight over a campsite called Fort Oranje was a brutal, first-hand lesson in how the state works, a lesson that he says would directly shape how he reacted during the COVID crisis.
So what was this whole Fort Oranje thing? Well, at its heart, it was just this long, drawn-out legal war. On one side, you had Engel's family, who owned the campsite, and on the other side, you had pretty much every level of the Dutch government, who seemed determined to shut them down.
And right at the center of Engel's story are these 2 alleged secret state operations, Project Maisveld and Project Blood Corral. He claims these were covert plans cooked up to systematically destroy his family's business, not through legal means, but through things like sabotage, smearing them in the media, and just burying them in legal attacks.
So you can see from this timeline just how long this whole thing dragged on. It all kicks off in 2012 when the family actually wins a huge court case. But Engel says that's when the state got sneaky and started these secret projects. The battle just went on for over a decade, finally ending in 2024 with a ruling that let the government take over. A decision Engel still calls bizarre, saying the court basically admitted the state was wrong but let them win anyway.
And well, this whole decade-long fight really solidified a core belief for Engel. For him, it was proof of a deep state that plays by its own rules, operating outside the law to get what it wants. This whole experience created this deep-seated distrust of the government in him way before COVID was even a thing.
All right, let's jump ahead to the spring of 2020. The world is locking down, his dance school is closed, so Engel basically dusts off his old textbooks and starts looking at the data with his biopharmaceutical background. And he says right away major red flags started popping up for him about the official story we were being told.
So what did he see? Well, his early analysis zeroed in on what he considered glaring problems. First, the 1.5-meter rule. He claimed there was no science to back that up. Then he looked at the fatality rate, arguing that the real data showed it was way lower than the scary numbers we first heard. All this led him to one conclusion. The extreme measures being taken were totally out of proportion for a virus that, for 99.8% of people, just wasn't the killer it was being sold as.
But what's really interesting here is that his first thought wasn't some grand conspiracy. Not at all. He just thought the whole thing was a total mess. He genuinely believed the government was just incompetent, panicking, and had absolutely no clue what it was doing.
But that feeling, that it was all just incompetence, it didn't last long. It quickly turned into organized opposition. Engel, along with his legal partner Jerome Poles, took the fight directly to the courts and the media. And that led to some of the most dramatic moments of the entire crisis in the Netherlands.
This leads us to maybe the most explosive moment of all, the national night curfew. I mean, how on earth did one lawsuit from a small activist group manage to completely upend a national policy overnight? It sounds impossible.
Well, on the morning of February 16th, 2021, the impossible happened. A court in The Hague actually ruled that the legal basis for the national curfew was totally invalid. It was this massive, shocking win for Engel's group, Viruswaarheid, and the court ordered the curfew to be lifted immediately.
But the victory was incredibly short-lived. The state's reaction was something else. In the morning, they lose. By the afternoon, they announce an emergency appeal for that same evening. A hearing is thrown together, and by the time it's dark, boom, the ruling is suspended. The curfew is back. In less than 12 hours, a national policy was struck down and then put right back into place. Engel calls it a textbook case of judicial manipulation.
It got so crazy that Engel's own lawyer, Jerome Poles, literally stood up and walked out of the appeal hearing. He just declared that the whole thing had nothing to do with real justice, that it violated due process, and he refused to be a part of it.
And here's the real kicker, the final word on that whole chaotic day. Much, much later, Ernst Kuipers, who was a central figure in the Dutch pandemic response and even became the Minister of Health, admitted in an interview that the curfew ended up having no effect at all. For Engel and his supporters, that was the ultimate vindication.
So when you take that whole curfew fiasco and you stack it on top of his experience with Fort Oranje, you can see how the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Engel. His initial belief that this was all just incompetence, that was completely replaced by a much, much darker conclusion. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional.
And this slide just shows you how fast his thinking changed. On the left, May 2020, he thinks it's just a big mess. Fast forward just 3 months to August, and look at the right. The language is completely different. Now he's saying a coup has been committed and that this is serious criminality.
So this is where he landed. His final analysis is that a silent coup was carried out by the Dutch security services way back in February 2020, and that democracy was basically put on hold without anyone even noticing. In his view, since the courts were compromised, the only power left was in mass protest, like the Canadian truckers' convoy. And he sees the failure of that global movement as a huge, tragic defeat, even comparing it to the crushed Hungarian Revolution in 1956.
And this really brings us to his ultimate conclusion, his final message from this whole ordeal. For Engel, the only real power that people have and the only way to resist is through mass civil disobedience. He truly believes that when enough people just stand up and say no, the system, no matter how powerful it seems, just can't enforce its will.
So we've walked through one man's very intense journey during a global crisis, all based on his own telling of the story. His path from a science lab to a dance studio to a courtroom is a pretty wild one. But it ultimately leaves us with a much bigger question, doesn't it? What does this kind of fierce conflict really tell us about that fragile relationship between citizens, science, and the power of the state, especially when things get scary?